Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the 2021 LSX Nordic Congress and to our keynote session hosted by McKinsey, driving the next wave of biotech innovation in the Nordics. As I mentioned in my opening remarks before, we have a fantastic set of content, panel discussions, presentations, masterclasses, forums coming up for you today. And I think this opening presentation will be a fantastic seed setter based on a report that we've been working on with McKinsey and with some research and interviews done with a number of the community who are hopefully watching this morning as well. So please do keep your questions coming in. Just a reminder there, if you go to the bottom right of your screen, there's the live discussion tab, click the up arrow, and then you can use the chat and questions function in the morning session. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can during and at the end in the Q&A section. So without further ado, delighted to hand over to the McKinsey team of Pavel Gongora and first Carsten Dalgaard. Carsten, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you, Josh, and good morning, everyone. First out, just a brief introduction. Carsten Dalgaard, I'm a senior partner with McKinsey here in Stockholm. I've been with McKinsey the last 17 years, and today I lead our life science practice here in the Nordics. And with me, I have Pavel Gongora, who's an associate partner also here in Stockholm. For those of you who don't know McKinsey, I think normally what we do most is we serve life science companies, either in accelerating their growth and improving their performance. And we're doing that increasingly through new models of ours, where we are also able to serve both startups and scale-ups. Today, though, we are taking a more industry-wide lens on things as opposed to the normal company lens that we look through things. And we look forward to present some of our first thoughts and draft findings. We have prepared 4 key messages for you, but to not spoil it all at once, we're going to take them one at a time. And we're going to go through it at a relatively fast pace. But of course, if any of you want to meet up one-on-one and discuss in more detail, we're happy to set that up following the conference. All right. So the first message that we wanted to deliver today was biotech, in our opinion, is a super exciting and great place to be in. Why do we say that? Well, actually, COVID-19 has been putting a lot of additional spotlight on biotech. People talk about vaccines and mRNA and biotech in a different way than they used to do. It's becoming more a household thing, and you can even sort of see online how a term like biotech is trending and being searched on way more than it has been previously. But obviously, it's not only about COVID-19 and searching online. Biotech is cool because it does a ton of good for people that suffer from life-threatening or debilitating diseases. We see cell therapies coming out, gene therapies, next-generation diagnostics. And if you think about it, a disease like SMA, in 2015, there were no treatments for that disease. Today, we have 3, all coming through gene therapy. So there are lots of exciting advances. And it's not just us who see this. This is also something that investors see. If you look at investments into biotechnology stocks, they are outperforming the general and wider indices significantly. And in more recent years, so when we look at the development between 2019 and 2020, we see that deal values, VC funding, and even IPO capital, all of these are increasing to levels significantly higher than previously. We also see that there used to be a little bit of a notion that biotech is only something I want to invest in if it comes from Boston or California. Now, Europe is on the move. We see here again a year-on-year comparison that the growth in deal value in Europe is outpacing the growth in the world more broadly. Same goes for VC funding and even more on the IPO side of things. So people are starting to warm up to the idea that even European biotech can do really good. Now, the question that we set out to understand more specifically, and perhaps of more relevance for you, is how's Nordic biotech's innovation engine actually performing in an international context? And that leads me to the second message we wanted to deliver today, which is the Nordic region is a global leader in innovation, but it's also a global laggard in turning science and innovation into business. And we'll show you how we arrived at this message. So in our biotech practice in McKinsey, we earlier this year, together with BCIQ, did a broad research effort into biotech. And we wanted to establish a way to benchmark how are the various regions performing on different parameters relative to each other. And so we developed something we call a Biotech Innovation Index. And it's really something that combines measures of innovation and funding along the typical journey that a biotech company would find itself in over its lifetime. And as you see here, and I think don't pay too much attention to the numbers per se, it's more to illustrate the relative moves and be able to compare over time. But you see that Nordic, one period ago, from 15 to 17, was performing reasonably well according to this Biotech Innovation Index. But actually in the latest 3-year period where we have data on, we're seeing an acceleration and improvement. And biotech, relatively speaking, in the Nordics is among the best in the world. So how did we come to that? Well, so our Biotech Innovation Index, we have constructed by looking at 7 different parameters here. So we've been looking at discovery, how many publications are coming out of the Nordics, are we patenting the innovation? We look at translation, so once there's a good idea, is that turned into a biotech company? And is there sufficient early stage financing available to make that happen? And once you have a company and it's about growing, then we look at growth capital. So how are we doing, relatively speaking, on late stage financing or even on public market capital? And then in the end, of course, it's a lot about drug approvals. So we look at the number of products launched. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of data along each of these 7 dimensions to give a sense of what we're finding. So first out, when we break this index down, where we were doing good on a global level, we see that firstly, that is due to a strong foothold in discovery. We see a discovery index that is way above the other regions, and I'll come back to that. However, which is going to be a big part of this presentation, we also see that this doesn't translate as well into companies as we see in other regions, which is worth discussing. Growth capital is actually doing quite well, more so in recent years. There's been a lot of initiatives in the Nordics in terms of making more capital available to grow companies, and we also see that that's moving up the ladder here. And lastly, on the impact, when you sort of look at number of drug launches per million capita, actually the Nordics is doing very well as a region. So I'm going to double click on each of these to give you a sense of what's sort of underneath it. So if we start out with discovery, when we look at the number of biotech publications per million capita, we see that the Nordics is far outpacing other regions. You see here a difference of roughly 3x and significantly outpacing both US and China. When we look at IP rights, we also see a high activity level, maybe not the 3x delta that you saw before, but still a 2x delta to the average. So we're seeing that a lot of these good ideas are being patented. And why do we think it's like that? Well, one of the reasons we think has to be because we have a relatively large share of top universities in the Nordics. Nordics only has 1% of the population, but it has 5% of the top 100 universities. So there's sort of a little bit of punching above our weight here when it comes to academia. When we then move into the next part of the index here, the translation index, we see that the ability to attract early stage capital is rather low. We see not that many early stage VC rounds, and compared to other regions, they are relatively small, those rounds. We also hear a lot from executives that where in the US, it's rather easy to get access to early stage capital up to $1 million to fund your company. In the Nordics, you may get a grant of say 300, 400, 500,000, but it comes with a ton of strings attached, which makes it a lot more difficult compared to the other regions to start companies. And not surprisingly, then what we then see is that when we start comparing here, the number of new biotechs founded is relatively low in the Nordics. Particularly, we see a general trend, which is over the last 3 years, there's a bit of a COVID effect. During 2020, there were fewer companies that started compared to the previous 3-year period. But in both of these pictures, we see that there's a lot higher entrepreneurial activity in the United States compared to the Nordics. And it should though also be mentioned that we do see that particularly companies like Nordic and Lundbeck that have these big foundations are seeing this and are increasingly starting to pump capital into the system. Once you have a company, then there's of course later stage funding, and here the differences to the rest of the world are not that big. Here we see that the average late stage VC funding round is about the same level as Europe, and while it's lower than US and China, it's much less of a difference compared to in the earlier stages. So there's sort of a notion of once you get over the hump here, you actually have as good odds as the rest. And when we look at the IPO side of things, there are good IPO activities in the Nordics, but what we see is that the IPO size of the rounds are typically smaller when comparing to other regions. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Nordic company that lists in the Nordic or whether you list on a US stock exchange, still compared to peers, the IPOs are smaller. And when it comes to follow-on rounds, so once you are public and you're raising additional capital, we see that there's no big difference. In fact, you could even argue that we are at par or even better than the European counterparts or US counterparts, at par with China. So really what we conclude here when we look at the funding part of it is it's really in the early stages that we're falling behind. And then finally, so the impact index, when we start looking at what's the number of drug approvals per million capita, we see that actually the Nordics is doing among the best out there. And so you can sort of see back to our index here that overall we're doing very good in an international context. That's sort of driven by a lot of good innovation and patent protection. It's not always translated well into companies, but once it is, it actually comes out really well compared to peers. Pavel, I'm going to give the word to you. What do we do about this translation problem that we observe in the Nordics, and why do you think we have that translation issue?
Exactly. So to get to that answer, we did a couple of things. We ran a couple of analyses on our end, and we spoke to a ton of stakeholders across the regions to really understand what is hampering the number of biotechs started and what is hampering that early stage funding. We see 3 main barriers. One is the very early capital access. driven by a low number of specialized VCs, and specifically biotech specialized VCs in the region, limited institutional investments, again, in the early stages, and then insufficient early public funding through various mechanisms to bridge that gap. And then the big pharma support varies between the Nordic countries, but is still considered subpar to the larger regions. The second main barrier is the tech transfer infrastructure, and this encompasses both IP ownership structures with universities, as well as the efficiency and scale of TTOs and incubators. And finally, mentality and talent. What we mean by that is specifically the kind of drive to become and to be a successful biotech entrepreneur, as well as the quality and availability of commercial talent specifically. To dive into a couple of these, we ran a couple of analyses, and the first one here that we're showcasing is we're looking at specialized life science venture funds, so those that have life science as their preferred vector, and closed funds, so fully raised and allocating capital. If we index this by million capita, we see that in number of funds, we're quite a bit lower in the Nordics versus US, 50% lower, and even lower than the hub, the main biotech hub in Europe, UK, slightly higher than the European level, the total European, out of which Nordics is a subset. But if you look at the money inside those funds, that's drastically lower compared to the US and UK and even the Europe average. Of course, this is not the full picture. Carsten said there are entities that allocate capital, such as the foundations, especially in Denmark, that bridge that gap quite well in that country. But as a proxy for specialized biotech expertise and the money, we are below scale. Next point, the next big barrier we talked about was tech transfer infrastructure. One big elephant in the room is just kind of the IP rights. And Sweden, of course, has the teachers exemption, meaning researchers can fully own the IPs, while the other Nordic countries have more of the traditional setup that many other countries around the world have, where the university gets to dictate and negotiate for IP rights. This is a little bit of an interesting situation because on one hand, you would imagine that the Swedes would be much more incentivized, and they are for a fact. However, that also means that the support they get, for example, in Sweden, often is felt to be much lower. The level of support is much lower than in the other countries, where the universities have more of an incentive to really push the transfer out and commercialize it. So kind of what is the net out of this? It's difficult to say, but in each case, there are clear barriers that the founders and the executives are mentioning. When we look at it on the kind of TTO performance side, and this is, TTOs are different in different countries and even in different universities. You have incubators that have TTO roles, and sometimes you don't, and it's just the university. But what we see across the board when we survey stakeholders across the regions is that Europe is definitely underperforming the US across the board. And then the Nordics, in some cases, especially in talent with biotech expertise and partnerships, are lagging even Europe. This is quite interesting as well, because we have a rather fragmented landscape of TTOs and incubators across the Nordics, and the quality and the level of support varies quite a lot, even in a country. So we think that there is some scale challenges here. In terms of mentality, it's a fact that we have fewer entrepreneurs in the Nordics versus the US. And then it's just, I even remember from my time in academia that, and I'm a medical doctor by training, that becoming an entrepreneur, becoming a biotech entrepreneur wasn't really on anyone's radar that I knew, any of my professors' radar. It was all about academia, and that's kind of what was perceived as the kind of nice thing to do, the noble thing to do. So we can imagine that translates into biotech incentive to found companies as well. Moreover, in terms of talent, so say that you would have a commercial or kind of a driven entrepreneur, biotech entrepreneur, who do they get on the team? And everyone we've spoken to says that the commercial talent specifically is more difficult to find here in the Nordics. And when we survey stakeholders for that, we see that as well. That's primarily the commercial talent, the quality and availability of such. And also here there are some regional differences where you would have in Denmark, for example, Norway, you still have big pharma. You still have pharma commercial kind of talent and experience in the country. In Sweden, we had Astra and we had Pharmacia. Those people, a lot of them are still around, but in different kind of constellations and in different ecosystems. So that can have an effect on the type of commercial knowledge you have in these regions. So what do we do about these kind of three main barriers, and how should biotechs, investors, the ecosystem think about this? Well, I think what we say here is that for the biotechs and investors, there are three main imperatives. Play on the global scene, think unicorn, and strengthen the capabilities that we know need to be strengthened. For the biotech ecosystem, it's really about the early stage translation support that needs to become much better, and then actually incubating that innovation that comes out of the universities. What do we mean by this? So play on the global scene, it might sound obvious, but really it's not. If we are in our region, I think potentially there's been a little bit of a vicious cycle where we stay local. It's more difficult to find capital, even abroad. So we continue to be local, and that makes truly global founders, executives, and companies quite rare. Everyone we speak to, both the executives and investors and the rest of the ecosystem, agree and say that we really need to over-index and be really pushy in terms of going global. And that means money for sure, it means talent, and it means commercialization opportunities. And again, global, we mean truly global. So it's not just the US, or it's not just the near Europe. I mean, think Asia and think China. China in the past couple of years has really developed some strong investors that are thinking very long term and are looking to be in the biotech innovation field really in the long run. And also their universities, some of them are coming out as better than the US ones in life sciences. To do this, the companies, the investors, they need to make sure they have the global credibility and networks in place to excite investors. You can't really show up in the US. I mean, you can, but it's going to be more difficult for you if you have no one in your executive team or no one in your very close network that can pitch you and can kind of make sure to elevate you in those global networks. So make sure you get that talent and you get those networks very early in your journey. Finally, we're in the Nordics, we're a part of Europe, but what we are launching here needs to be thought of very early as global market competitors on a global market with global products. And that's how these should be pitched. And that's, frankly, that's what investors are expecting much of the time. Thinking unicorn is, if you just look at business at a whole, yeah, maybe again, that's a bit obvious. But I think in the Nordics, we're very well positioned. We're uniquely positioned to really learn from some of our peers in other industries. We know that we're the second, at least Sweden is at least second highest number of unicorns per capita in the world. And they're almost all tech. So, I mean, it's not biotech, but it's still tech, and they're in our backyard. So we should kind of get inspiration from them, raise our ambition levels, and raise our ambitions also for the rounds, the investment rounds we have, and making sure that we have also those kind of unicorn supporting cornerstone investors to accelerate the path to launch. In terms of capabilities, we know that there are a couple of capabilities, especially on the commercial side, that are less developed here in the Nordics than in other regions. So again, here, thinking broader in who we bring on our teams and being more proactive than maybe other regions have to be is going to be important to kind of ensure we have the right people, not only for clinical development, but also for the pitches and launches that will get us to impact. The commercial capabilities specifically, we've seen and we hear need to be leveled up to compete on the global stage. And then the market insights, something that when we speak to investors, something that often comes up is that the tech side we feel, or they feel fine about, but they're a bit put off in some cases by lacking market insights, lacking global market insights as the companies are developed and as they're looking for more funding. Finally, many of the people we've spoken to have said that, it's not the easiest to have fully global teams or have the global expertise and attract people to the Nordic regions always. But here, I think, as we McKinsey have found out, it's much easier to work virtually than we thought before. And this is really the age of the virtual. So I think that can be done. For the ecosystem, there are a couple of things. First, for the early stage translation support, we just think there needs to be more and smarter money going to the TTOs and incubators to support that translation. Because if the kind of inherent drive isn't as high as in other regions, and then the TTOs are kind of underperforming those, that really puts in a kind of fundamental problem and a hurdle in this translation of the innovation. Secondly, also make sure that the excitement is there, that capabilities are built early, and there's significant mentorship of scientists and entrepreneurs to really empower them to become the next biotech unicorns. So just don't sit back and wait for people to kind of want to do this by themselves, but stimulate this actively. Finally, for the TTOs and incubators, we think there can be more syndication and a more kind of centralization of the support platforms, meaning it's great that we have them in many places, but they need to have much more scale. So create kind of central groups of the best talent, the most networked people, the most experienced people, and have them as kind of small centers of excellence for the TTOs and incubators. So what do we do as well to actually marinate the innovation? I think there's one thing. There can be a more systematic approach to drive the innovation, so we can reduce the capital burden across the board. And examples of that would be the UK Catapult, for example, to support the cell and gene therapy biotechs that has a huge center of excellence with, I think it's 300 employees, and offer a lot of support to the CGT biotechs. Secondly, on the kind of public or state level, I think more can be done to articulate on the global scene the attractiveness of our sector, and also develop fact packs or guides for international investors to have confidence to invest. Several times we've heard from executives that they found someone in Europe that would be happy to invest. However, they were a bit put off by their lack of regional knowledge. And if they couldn't find a regional investor, then it was mostly kind of on the hearsay of the executive is what the investors had to go on. Finally, we have some fantastic registries and data banks in the Nordics, in the individual countries, and also across Nordics. But here we think we can do more to become true leaders, even on the European stage, to create pan-European or even larger registries and indices to accelerate that innovation. So where does this leave us? Well, again, we have great discoverers. Pound for pound, we're the best. Translation is where the main hurdle is at, but there are clear actions that can be taken to alleviate this. And as Carsten said, as soon as you get over that translation hump, the future looks much brighter, with easier access to capital and a shorter path to impact. So all in all, great time to be in biotech and a great area to be in biotech, with a couple of challenges that I think can be pushed to be solved. And that is us. Thank you everyone for this, and we're happy to take questions.
Fantastic, thank you, Pavel. I'll actually maybe ask you to keep the slides up rather than moving them off, just in case we do need to revert back. We do have a few minutes for questions here, so if you do have any after seeing the full presentation, please do post. I did see one come through, which I think you then answered, Pavel, looking at the teacher's exemption in Sweden. And I think that was sort of answered during the presentation. Through from Christopher Katkitz, who asked about could the low translation index but high impact index mean that the Nordics are actually good in selecting promising or viable candidates? So by that he means perhaps the translation index isolated doesn't look good, but together with the impact index, this may actually be positive in that many projects are shut down earlier rather than later. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that, either of you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit, it's almost like the force of evolution, right? If everyone is bootstrapped, cash strapped, and support strapped from the infrastructure, the absolute best ideas likely are the ones that go through. And that's what's driving the higher impact. So very well, that could be it. I would believe, though, that as a region, we wouldn't necessarily want to be among the worst in the world of supporting and funding early stage innovation, just because we might be missing quite a couple of things. And we're also kind of disincentivizing and decreasing the motivation for people to become entrepreneurs. So agree on mathematically and kind of what that leads to. Don't know if that is the best answer for our region.
No, I think you could also see it as it is also not unlikely to imagine a scenario where if we become a lot better at translation, you would see the impact index go even further up. So that's sort of our hypothesis, that it is too restrictive, it is too undernourished initially. And if there was more nourishment coming into the system, we would see even more coming out in the end.
We're going to be digging quite a lot into, we actually have a panel on expediting translation of innovation coming up a little later on today at 12 CET. So please do join for that if that particular topic was of interest here. We have a question through as well, a couple which I'm going to try and link together if possible. So we had a question about any particular modalities or therapeutic areas that you see Nordic innovation being particularly strong or weak in. And then another question, which I'm going to see if I can tack on if it makes sense for you both, which is, have you seen any fundraising issues? This is from Francois Martelet. Any funding issues related to CAR T specifically due to the negative Novartis trial with Kymriah? So I guess any particular modalities and therapeutic areas that are strong in, and then have you seen anything specific around funding, particularly for CAR T therapies?
So on the first question, so if we look at it from kind of what is being researched on and what companies are being started, I think what we see is across the Nordics, kind of pharma services, immunotherapies are maybe and oncology more in Denmark are maybe the larger therapy areas where we do both the research and where we have growth in, a high absolute number of companies and a growth in number of companies. I think when we compare with the other European countries, for pharma services or support kind of biotechs, we are one of the top 3 countries in terms of number of companies in that subfield in Sweden. In Denmark, we are one of the 3 growth centers for oncology. So most oncological specialized companies being started in the recent years. Where we lag, I will say that I think across the board we have a rather high number of cell and gene therapy companies in the Nordics, but that is not reflected in the research that is being published. So there's a bit of a delta there. In Europe, we have, I think it's a quarter of all the publications are in advanced medicinal therapies, including cell and gene therapies. But in Nordics, I think that number is like 11%. So we're much lower than European average, which might have some long-term consequences. On the second question of have we seen lower funding in cell and gene therapy, it's a good question. We have the numbers somewhere. I don't remember them. I think yes, kind of excitement and funding slowed down a little bit. Because of that factor, but at the same time, what we see is that there's an explosion in the number of companies that go for new vectors and new indications. So it's much, much broader in these past couple of years only than cell and gene therapy focuses or foci were a couple of years ago. So there's still kind of meaningful excitement and funding going into that.
Yeah, I would only add to that, Pavel, and say on gene therapy, there's been a couple of setbacks too, and that doesn't seem to have significantly hampered investors' interest in the area, broadly speaking. So it's probably too early to rule out a very good future for CAR-T as well.
Fantastic. We've had another question in from Søren Møller from Novo Seeds. Do you see any signs that the highlighted challenges that you mentioned are being addressed?
So some of them, I would say the ones that the biotechs and that we mentioned, biotechs and the investors should pursue, I think not at all to the extent they would need to alleviate this hurdle significantly. On the ecosystem side, I think the focus, and in different countries it's been different, right? The starting of BII in Denmark is for sure a big step in that direction. For example, in Sweden, there's a lot more public mechanisms for funding than there were years ago. So a little bit is being done. We still think to really unleash the engine here and tap into the full potential, quite a bit more needs to be taken. And frankly, this is the right time to do so. This is like in the midst of COVID, everything is about biotech. If you want to reimagine and reinvent what this region will do in biotech, there hasn't been a better time than now for that.
Fantastic. We're running a little bit over time here, but you mentioned the BII there. That's actually, Bobby is going to be hosting the panel on translation a little later on, and it kind of links to a question we have from Matt Hogberg. He said, very interesting presentation on the business incubators and that sort of model. You know, how could you tell us what you would categorize as good ones, or what is an important thing for these business incubators, rather than sort of naming names, I guess, what category good incubator or accelerator?
So part of it is really scale, and it needs to be smart scale. So it's not just having the number of heads in there, while actually, I mean, that is important, but it needs to be good scale. So it needs to be to have the right set of expertise. You need to have internationally networked, well-established, experienced executives that could support these companies. You need to have the funding to come with that. It can't just be small grants and being kind of bootstrapped your whole journey. You need to see kind of the light in the tunnel in that journey, especially in regions where maybe the motivation to be entrepreneurs in biotech is maybe a bit smaller than in other places.
And I think with benefit part, one can look at the tech more broadly. I think the tech scene has managed to create these environments that are cool and vibrant, and it's even sort of to the extent that where people perhaps haven't thought about being entrepreneurs before, because these incubators are so cool to participate in, you're actually now starting to think about, maybe I should bring something out there as well. So I think we can learn a lot from tech more broadly.
I agree. I mean, I have people I know, acquaintances that I would think would never go into, a tech startup or scale up. They're really not the type of people who would. But because of this hype, that's where they are. They're country managers, or they're even, CEOs of some of these companies. But none of these folks are going to biotech to do so. So there's something about how it's perceived and positioned as well.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, we're running a little bit over time. I think, as I said at the beginning of this, we have a lot of topics that you've dug into there, which are going to be covered throughout the rest of the agenda. Our next session starts in about 10 minutes and is on the sort of listing question, and you've sort of gone into that, IPO and follow-on discussion as well a little bit. And again, the translation panel starting at 12 o'clock. So please do keep the conversation going. There are still some questions in the Swapcard chat platform that we're not going to be able to get to today, but I'm sure sure both Pavel and Carsten would be very happy to answer them, and maybe you can set up and engage with a meeting on the platform, and indeed continue the conversation in the chat function there as well. A huge thank you to Carsten and Pavel for the research and the report and putting together the presentation. I think it's always fantastic insights and some really good data and information to dig into, so please do reach out to them. But for now, look forward to seeing you in our next session at 10 o'clock, and please do continue engaging on the platform.
Super. Thank you for having us, Josh.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.